Today, we will follow the oldest language of fear in human history. We will pursue a single figure, yet what we will actually be observing is far more than one figure. The relationship the human mind establishes with darkness, the faces it creates to explain the unknown, and the idea of the invisible enemy used to bring societies into line. This narrative is born in a place where light and darkness intertwine. In some tellings, there is a fall, in others, a rebellion. In certain traditions, this figure is the very name of absolute evil. In others, it becomes a symbol of questioning and free will. In the modern age, it appears with an entirely different identity, Lucifer. When people think of Lucifer today, no single image comes to mind. On one side lie thousands of years of theological debate. On the other, an image polished and reshaped by popular culture. Beyond that, over the past few decades, the internet has carried a conspiracy narrative. Elites worship Lucifer. Though the claim itself may seem new, the psychology and infrastructure that sustain it are in fact very old. Because the concept we call Lucifer, or Satan, does not like to behave as if it emerged from a single source. It accumulates layer by layer. The fears, wars, exiles, conflicts of belief, and struggles for power of different cultures pile up on top of one another. In the end, what emerges is not a single being, but an entire mythology. Was evil a single being? Not in Mesopotamia. Let us begin at the very beginning. Mesopotamia, one of the earliest centers of civilization. Here, however, there is a striking detail. In the Sumerian world, there is no single, ultimate character of evil like the devil we speak of today. Evil is not imagined as a king gathered into a single personality. Rather, it is a scattered energy, sometimes a disaster carried by the wind, sometimes an illness, sometimes an unexplainable fear that descends in the night. Sumerian priests and scribes tended to attribute inexplicable suffering to beings that had names. This was an attempt to impose mental order. If it has a name, perhaps it can be controlled. This was one of the earliest functions of demons. For this reason, Sumerian tablets present us not with one devil, but with many different beings corresponding to different calamities, lamashtu, infant deaths, fears of childbirth, threats to mother and child. This figure can be understood as a dark explanation for that fragile period in which birth and death intertwine. Pazuzu, the personification of winds and destruction. Interestingly, it appears in amulets both as a harmful force and as one that wards off other harms. A sag, imagined as the bearer of diseases, feverish epidemics, and afflictions that burn from within. Utaku and Galu, restless spirits, shadows that watch and disturb. Very early forms of the motifs we see today in folk narratives such as night hag, possession, and evil spirits. This picture shows us something important. From the earliest cultures onward, humans perceived evil not as a single great enemy, but as a disorder spread throughout life. When an epidemic broke out, it was not that the city was contaminated, but that something had entered. When agriculture withered, it was not that the climate changed, but that it breathed upon the land. When death arrived, people did not seek chance, but a face. At this point, something crucial happens. To manage fear, the human mind makes it concrete. As it becomes concrete, fear itself changes form. After a while, those beings become not merely explanations of fear, but fear itself. With Babylon, evil turns into something larger. In the Babylonian world that inherited the Sumerian legacy, the idea of demons evolves. Here, evil is no longer just scattered disasters, but begins to take shape as a greater principle, chaos. The seeds of cosmic narratives resembling a war between good and evil grow stronger in this period. One of the most well-known symbols of this transformation is the myth of Tiamat. Tiamat is not merely a goddess. She is also conceived as disorder before order, the raw, frightening uncertainty that existed before the rules of the world humans inhabit were established. It is here that the cultural ground for the idea of the great enemy who opposes God gains strength. The power that establishes order clashes with the power that disrupts it. This schema will be reborn centuries later under different names. Exile, contact, and transformation. the earliest form of Satan in Jewish texts. Later, the Jewish faith becomes prominent on the historical stage of the region. But here too there is a turning point, the Babylonian exile. Forced contact with different cultures is one of the places where concepts are reshaped. This period prepares the ground for clearer discussions of ideas such as the conflict between good and evil, invisible forces influencing human fate, and the personification of chaos. Yet let us be clear, in early Hebrew texts, the word Satan does not mean Satan in the sense we understand today. In early texts, Satan functions more like an accuser, a tester, one who brings a case. It operates like a kind of overseer or prosecutor. It is not an independent empire of evil acting on its own. It cannot move without God's permission. The book of Job is decisive in this respect. Satan appears as a figure who tests human loyalty. So at this stage, there is still no picture of a fallen angel, leader of a universal rebellion, or Lord of Hell. These are layers that will emerge later. With the New Testament, the figure darkens, the tempter and leader of rebellion. Time passes. By the Christian era, the world is a different place. The dissolution of Rome, conflicts of belief, the spread of new religions, and confrontations between old traditions and new systems. Such periods are fertile ground for strengthening the idea of an invisible enemy. At this point, the figure of Satan changes. It is no longer merely a tester performing a function, but becomes a tempter, a deceiver, a character at the center of evil. The idea of God's adversary is drawn more sharply. The mechanism at work here is this. When society is in crisis, uncertainty increases, and fear rises, people want fear to have a focal point. Diffuse fear is exhausting. Focused fear seems manageable. This accelerates the growth of the idea of a singular devil. Medieval Europe, Satan becomes not only religion, but part of order itself. The major leap occurs in medieval Europe. Here, Satan is no longer merely a concept living in texts. He is placed at the center of social engineering, political authority, and the management of fear. This period can be understood through three main dynamics. The systematization of demonology. The church frames evil and Satan within a theoretical structure. Thinkers, clergy, and theologians define, classify, and sharpen the narrative of this figure. Evil ceases to be an abstract idea and begins to be spoken of like a historical actor. The explosion of hell imagery. In societies with limited literacy, images are powerful. Paintings, reliefs, frescoes, cathedral walls. When hell and Satan are rendered as visible realities, abstract fear becomes part of everyday life. People begin not only to hear fear, but to see it. The socialization of witch hunts and the idea of pacts with the devil. In this period, Satan moves from the notion of individual sin to becoming the fuel of social paranoia. Witch hunts, interrogation records, confessions, accusations of collaboration with Satan feed a massive hysteria. Works such as Heinrich Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum function as practical guides for this fear. At this point, Satan assumes perhaps the most dangerous role in history. He becomes the name of fear itself. The invisible enemy turns into one of power's most useful instruments. Because an invisible enemy can be anywhere. It makes everyone suspect. It brings society into line. It increases obedience. The great transformation. The figure of fear becomes, for some, a symbol of freedom. Over time, the process also reverses. For some people, the figure of Satan ceases to be an enemy to fear and takes on a different meaning: questioning, rebellion, individual will. Three approaches are discussed here, though two in particular are often confused. Theistic Satanism. In this approach, Satan/Lucifer is a real being, accepted as a spiritual reality like God. The ground for such thinking has been influenced throughout history by dualistic movements that interpret the universe through a conflict between a good God and an evil God. In the modern period, this has existed only within small and limited circles. Luciferianism. In this line, Lucifer is generally not a god, but a symbol, an archetype of the light bringer, the one who questions, resists dogma, seeks knowledge. Here, Lucifer is separated from the classical devil narrative. This symbolic interpretation can be found in some occult circles and New Age currents. The key distinction here is this. Theistic Satanism believes in a being, while Luciferianism rests on a symbol. The modern age, Satanism without Satan, Levi, and the atheistic current. Then, in the modern world, an even sharper break occurs, a movement that uses the name Satanism despite not believing in Satan. In 1966, Anton LaVey founded the Church of Satan in San Francisco and published the Satanic Bible. The claim here is this: there is no supernatural being called Satan. Yet the symbol of Satan is preserved because it represents the individual placing themselves at the center against authority. In atheistic Satanism, the emphasis is generally on the following: the will of the individual instead of external authority, worldly pleasure and responsibility instead of the concept of sin, personal choice instead of blind obedience, worldly reality instead of metaphysical seeking. This approach carries a secular manifesto language that turns classical religious understanding upside down. Here, Satan is a metaphorical mirror. It can be read as the human being owning their own darkness and desire. The 2010s and a new break, the Satanic Temple and the political symbol. After the 2000s, another contemporary current emerges, the Satanic Temple, 2013. This organization openly states that it does not believe in the supernatural and rejects claims of ritual and magic. Nevertheless, it uses the label Satanist because it sees Satan as a symbol of freedom against the impositions of state and religious authority. The most discussed aspect of this approach is its political/activist actions rather than belief. They argue that if a single religion is granted privilege in public space, then equality requires that other symbols also be given space. Thus, Satan here becomes less a theological being than a political sign. Popular culture, Satan as an aesthetic, a brand, a stage language. When we arrive at the present day, the figure of Satan spreads across a much wider field: Hollywood, pop music, fashion, design, the internet. But what must be noted here is this: many satanic symbols we see today often do not represent a genuine belief. They function more as an aesthetic language and a tool for producing shock. Hand gestures, stage performances, clip iconography, red lights, inverted crosses. Some of these operate entirely through marketing and visual shock. Yet society, using fear patterns inherited from the Middle Ages, tends to read these images as signs of secret cults. This brings us back to the starting point. Modern conspiracy narratives such as elites worship Lucifer are often updated versions of the medieval fear schema. The human mind likes to search for hidden rituals behind power because the idea is both frightening and fascinating. Literature and cinema, Satan as a representation of the human inner world. The figure of Satan finds its greatest power in the realm of art, because art reflects the collective unconscious of society. Satan is therefore excellent material. Temptation, desire, fear, taboo, power, obedience, rebellion, all can easily be loaded onto this figure. Mephistopheles in the Faust narrative is an example of this. Here, Satan is not merely a demon. He is the embodied form of human hunger, dissatisfaction, the desire for knowledge, and inner emptiness. Likewise, in modern cinema, Satan is sometimes portrayed as a supernatural threat and sometimes as a metaphor for networks of power operating behind closed doors. One film depicts Satan as a being that enters the body. Another portrays Satan as decision-making mechanisms wandering through offices. Sometimes the fear is not the demon itself, but the intention, ambition, and desire for power hidden within the human being. So why does this story never end? Because Satan stands in the shadow of one of humanity's most fundamental questions. Where does evil come from? In every age in which we cannot give a clear answer to this question, the figure of Satan is reborn. Sometimes as a demon, sometimes as a prosecutor, sometimes as a leader of rebellion, sometimes as a symbol, sometimes as popular culture iconography. What does not change is this: human beings want to project their own darkness outward. When evil is placed outside, it feels easier to cope with. That is why Satan is not merely a character, but a mirror. And that is why this narrative never ends. Because humanity's relationship with darkness never ends.